Today we're diving into a topic that's been eating at me for a while now, the spectacular disappointment that was Five Nights at Freddy's in real time. This is about understanding why a project that had so much potential, so much hype, and honestly so many good ideas, ended up being such a colossal letdown. Five Nights at Freddy's 1, despite being over a decade old at this point, is still a masterclass in horror game design. Yeah, it's dated, yeah, it's simple by today's standards, but that simplicity is exactly what made it work. So when Taaryn announced they were making a real-time version, essentially a remaster that would bring the classic into the modern era while keeping the core gameplay intact, it sounded like a dream come true. But here's the thing, sometimes the best ideas on paper become the worst experiences in practice. Let's start with the core concept, because this is where the problems began. The idea of Five Nights at Freddy's in real time sounds incredible, right? Instead of those choppy, low frame rate camera feeds, you'd get smooth, realistic movement. Instead of static images with occasional updates, you'd see the animatronics moving naturally through the building. And honestly, when you first boot up the game and see that opening sequence with Bonnie and Chica moving smoothly in real time, it looks fantastic. The visual quality is genuinely impressive, and for a moment, you think, wow, this is what Five Nights at Freddy's could have been with a bigger budget and modern technology. But here's the fundamental problem. Five Nights at Freddy's 1 wasn't scary because of what you could see clearly. It was scary because of what you couldn't see, what you had to imagine, and what your brain filled in during those moments of uncertainty. The choppy cameras, the static, the way animatronics would suddenly appear in different positions. All of that was intentional. It created an atmosphere of unreliability and paranoia that made every camera check feel dangerous. When you make everything smooth and clear, you lose that essential element of uncertainty. Instead of your imagination running wild during those moments between camera updates, you're just watching robots walk around. It's more realistic, sure, but it's also way less scary. The developers fundamentally misunderstood that FNAF's technical limitations weren't bugs to be fixed. They were features that created the horror. Now, we need to talk about the elephant in the room, Brother. This character represents everything wrong with how Five Nights at Freddy's in real time approached the source material. Here's a character that was heavily advertised, plastered all over the promotional materials, and positioned as a major addition to the Five Nights at Freddy's 1 experience. And what does Brother actually do in the game? He shows up at the beginning, barely appears throughout the middle, and then gives a speech at the end. That's it. He has no impact on gameplay, no meaningful integration with the story, and honestly feels like he could be completely removed from the game without changing anything significant. But the real problem isn't just that Brother is underdeveloped, it's that he replaces Golden Freddy. Think about that for a second. Golden Freddy is one of the most iconic and mysterious characters in Five Nights at Freddy's history. His rare appearances, his game-crashing jump scare, his connection to the deeper lore, all of that gets thrown out the window for a character who does absolutely nothing. This reeks of ego and poor decision-making. Instead of understanding what made the original characters work and building on that foundation, the developers decided they could do better and create their own character to replace an established favorite. It's the kind of decision that shows a fundamental misunderstanding of why people love Five Nights at Freddy's in the first place. The fact that Brother feels like a self-insert just makes it worse. When you're supposed to be creating the definitive version of Five Nights at Freddy's 1, replacing iconic elements with your own original characters is incredibly presumptuous and ultimately destructive to the experience. One of FNAF 1's greatest strengths was its atmosphere, and a huge part of that came from its absolutely masterful sound design. Every audio cue was carefully crafted to create maximum tension and paranoia. The distant footsteps, the mechanical sounds, the way the music would cut out at just the right moments. It was all perfectly calibrated to keep you on edge. Five Nights at Freddy's in real time completely butchers this. The music is generic and uninspired, lacking any of the subtle tension building that made the original so effective. Where Five Nights at Freddy's 1 knew when to use silence to create dread, real-time fills every moment with unnecessary audio that dilutes the impact. The ambient sounds that should be creating paranoia instead just sound like normal building sounds. The mechanical noises that should be ominous just sound like machines operating normally. It's like they took the original's carefully crafted horror symphony and replaced it with elevator music. This ties back to the fundamental misunderstanding we talked about earlier. The developers saw Five Nights at Freddy's 1's audio as outdated and rough around the edges, so they improved it by making everything cleaner and more professional. But in doing so, they destroyed the very elements that made the original audio so effective at creating fear. Here's another major issue. Five Nights at Freddy's in real time relies way too heavily on scripted events instead of emergent gameplay. The original Five Nights at Freddy's one was brilliant because every night felt different, even though the core mechanics remained the same. The AI behavior, while simple, created enough randomness that you never knew exactly what to expect. Real time, on the other hand, feels like you're going through predetermined sequences. Night 3's Foxy Rampage, for example, isn't really about adapting to changing AI behavior. It's about memorizing a pattern and executing it correctly. Once you know what's going to happen and when, the challenge becomes trivial and the fear disappears entirely. This approach fundamentally misunderstands what makes survival horror engaging. The best horror games create scenarios where you have to react to unpredictable threats using limited resources. When everything becomes scripted, you're no longer surviving. You're just following a choreographed routine. The scripted events also highlight how the developers were trying to justify the real-time concept. Since the core Five Nights at Freddy's 1 gameplay doesn't really benefit from real-time visuals, they had to create these elaborate scripted sequences to show off the technology. But these sequences feel like tech demos rather than integrated gameplay experiences. One of the most damning criticisms of Five Nights at Freddy's in real time is that it's boring. And you know what? The early nights of the original Five Nights at Freddy's 1 were kinda boring too. Nights 1 through 3 are pretty slow and don't offer much challenge for experienced players. But here's the difference. In 2014, that pacing worked because everything about FNAF was new and mysterious. Players were still learning the mechanics, still discovering the lore, still getting scared by jump scares they'd never seen before. The slow buildup was part of the experience because the experience itself was fresh. In 2023, or whenever real time was released, that same pacing doesn't work anymore. Players know Five Nights at Freddy's inside and out. They've played dozens of fan games with more complex mechanics and faster pacing. Coming back to the slow, methodical pace of the original feels tedious rather than atmospheric. Five Nights at Freddy's in real time needed to understand this and adapt accordingly. Instead of faithfully recreating the pacing issues of the original, they should have found ways to make the early nights more engaging while maintaining the core gameplay loop. The mini-game sections between nights were a step in the right direction, but they weren't enough to solve the fundamental pacing problems. There's something deeply unsettling about Five Nights at Freddy's in real time, and I don't mean in a good horror way. It's uncanny in the worst possible sense, familiar enough to trigger nostalgia, but different enough to feel wrong. It's like looking at a photograph of your childhood home, but all the proportions are slightly off, and the colors don't match your memory. This uncanny valley effect is particularly damaging for a project that's supposed to be the definitive version of a beloved classic. When people boot up Five Nights at Freddy's in real time, they're expecting to feel that same rush of nostalgia and fear they got from the original. Instead, they get something that looks like FNAF and sounds like FNAF, but doesn't feel like FNAF. The problem is that the developers focus too much on surface-level improvements, better graphics, smoother animations, higher resolution, without understanding that these elements weren't what made Five Nights at Freddy's special in the first place. It's like colorizing a black and white film and expecting it to automatically become better. The original Five Nights at Freddy's had soul, character, and a distinct personality that came from its limitations as much as its strengths. Five Nights at Freddy's in real time feels sterile and corporate by comparison, like a focus-grouped version of something that was originally created by pure creative instinct. Let's talk about the voice acting, because this is another area where Five Nights at Freddy's in real time completely missed the mark. The original Five Nights at Freddy's one had the phone guy, voiced by Scott Cawthon himself, delivering those iconic calls with a perfect mix of helpfulness and underlying dread. Five Nights at Freddy's in real time tries to expand on this with additional voice acting and cutscenes, but the performances feel forced and over the top. Instead of the subtle, unsettling delivery of the original phone guy, we get performances that feel like they belong in a Saturday morning cartoon rather than a horror game. This ties into a larger problem with the project, the assumption that more is automatically better. The original Five Nights at Freddy's was effective partly because of its restraint. It didn't over-explain things, didn't have elaborate cutscenes, and didn't try to be more than it needed to be. Real-time throws restraint out the window in favor of more content, more story, more everything, and the experience suffers as a result. Here's something interesting to consider. Five Nights at Freddy's in real time exists in a world where incredible Five Nights at Freddy's fan games already exist. Games like The Joy of Creation, One Night at Flumpty's, and countless others have shown what's possible when you take the Five Nights at Freddy's formula and expand on it creatively. These fan games succeed because they understand that they can't just recreate the original experience. They need to offer something new and different. They take inspiration from Five Nights at Freddy's while carving out their own identity and bringing fresh ideas to the table. Five Nights at Freddy's in real time, on the other hand, positions itself as a replacement for the original rather than a creative expansion. It's trying to be the same game, just better, and that's an impossible task. You can't improve on a classic by just making it prettier and calling it definitive. The fan game community has moved far beyond simple recreations and remasters. Players expect innovation, creativity, and fresh takes on familiar formulas. Five Nights at Freddy's in real time feels like it's stuck in 2015, trying to solve problems that the community moved past years ago. The marketing for Five Nights at Freddy's in real time promised the world. It was going to be the definitive version of Five Nights at Freddy's 1, the way the game was meant to be played, a complete reimagining that would make the original obsolete. These are massive promises that set expectations incredibly high. But here's the thing about marketing. If you promise the moon and deliver a pebble, people are going to be disappointed even if the pebble is perfectly fine on its own merit. Five Nights at Freddy's in real time might have been received more positively if it had been marketed as a cool Five Nights at Freddy's 1 fan game with real-time graphics instead of the definitive Five Nights at Freddy's 1 experience. The brother character is a perfect example of this marketing mismatch. He was prominently featured in promotional materials, suggesting he would be a major part of the experience. When players discovered he was basically an extended cameo, it felt like false advertising. The marketing also failed to manage expectations about what the game actually was. People expected innovation and creativity, but what they got was essentially a graphics mod with some scripted events tacked on. That's not necessarily bad, but it's not what was promised. Five Nights at Freddy's and real-time's failures highlight a broader truth about video game remasters. They're much harder to do well than most people realize. It's not just about updating graphics and fixing bugs. You have to understand what made the original work and figure out how to preserve those elements while making meaningful improvements. The best remasters, like the recent Resident Evil remakes or the Shadow of the Colossus remake, succeed because they understand the soul of the original game and build on that foundation. They don't just make things prettier, they identify what made the original special and find ways to enhance those elements with modern technology. Five Nights at Freddy's in real time feels like it was made by people who saw FNAF 1 as a collection of assets and mechanics, rather than a carefully crafted experience. They updated the assets and mechanics without understanding how they worked together to create the original's unique atmosphere and gameplay feel. This is why so many fan game developers choose to create spiritual successors or inspired by games rather than direct remasters. It's often easier to capture the spirit of a classic by creating something new than by trying to directly improve the original. There's also a question of preservation here. Five Nights at Freddy's 1 is a historically important game that defined indie horror for years. When someone creates a definitive version that fundamentally changes the experience, are they preserving that history or erasing it? Five Nights at Freddy's in real time positions itself as a replacement for the original, suggesting that players should choose it over the classic version. But in doing so, it risks making people forget what made the original special in the first place. It's like painting over a historical mural with a more technically proficient but less characterful version. The original FNAF one, with all its limitations and dated elements, is still worth playing and preserving. It represents a specific moment in gaming history and showcases design principles that are still relevant today. Projects like Real Time, by positioning themselves as improvements rather than alternatives, risk undermining the legacy they claim to honor. Despite all these criticisms, it's worth noting that FNAF in Real Time wasn't completely without merit. The visual improvements were genuinely impressive, and you could see the passion and effort that went into the project. The team clearly cared about Five Nights at Freddy's and wanted to create something special. The problem wasn't lack of effort or talent. It was misplaced priorities and fundamental misunderstandings about what made the original work. These are common problems in fan projects, and they don't reflect poorly on the creators as people or developers. The team behind Real Time has reportedly moved on to working on projects related to the Five Nights at Freddy's movie, which honestly sounds like a better fit for their talents. Working with different source material and different expectations might allow them to create something genuinely innovative rather than trying to improve perfection. Five Nights at Freddy's in Real Time was doomed to fail, not because the team lacked talent or passion, but because they set themselves an impossible task and approached it with fundamental misunderstandings about what made FNAF special. But perhaps it reminds us why the original Five Nights at Freddy's one is still worth playing and respecting. Its limitations weren't bugs to be fixed. They were features that created a unique and irreplaceable experience. Sometimes the best way to honor a classic is to leave it alone and create something new alongside it rather than trying to replace it. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe for more. And hey, if you disagree with any of my points, let me know in the comments.